Amidst the biting cold of the 2025 Eastern European winter in the capital of Ukraine, an event that seemed like a mere administrative formality was signaling the biggest political upheaval since the conflict began. Without fanfare or the flashy pronouncements of the Western media, on December 26th, a group of 60 Ukrainian officials and parliamentarians quietly convened. The topic of the meeting was elections. But behind those two words, discerning observers understood that this was not a meeting about democracy, but a meeting to prepare for a major political upheaval. It was a carefully orchestrated farewell ceremony for President Vladimir Zelensky, who, from his position as a symbol, now faces the risk of being cast into the pantheon of history by both his own people and allies. So what exactly happened? Let's find out in today's video. To understand why the December 26th meeting was so fateful, we need to look back at the overall political landscape of Ukraine over the past year. Zelensky's term had effectively ended long ago. According to the Ukrainian constitution, elections should have taken place in the spring of 2024. However, under the guise of martial law, the Kyiv government repeatedly postponed them. Throughout that time, Ukrainian and Western propaganda machines tried to portray the lack of elections as a way to unite the nation. But the reality was far more brutal. They were afraid to face the truth. The fact that the Ukrainian parliament, under pressure from the situation, hastily formed a special working group and convened it immediately after Christmas shows that the patience of all parties has run out. Alexander Kornienko, first Deputy Speaker of Parliament. Despite trying to use sophisticated language such as preparing legislative proposals or discussing technical challenges, could not hide the government's utter confusion and desperation. Why now? Why the end of 2025? The answer lies in the suffocating pressure from Washington, as the U.S. president publicly declared that Ukraine had gone too long without elections and that the Ukrainian people needed the right to choose. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a thinly veiled order. The West, those who truly control the chessboard in Ukraine, seems to have realized that the current chess pieces are too old. It's worn out and no longer capable of effective negotiation or combat. They need a new face, a new, more legitimate apparatus to continue their schemes, or to pave the way for an inevitable compromise with Russia. Just the numbers speak for themselves, and Zelensky's dream is over. If pressure from the U.S. is the external stranglehold, then the disastrous decline in domestic prestige is the internal chokehold that has stifled Zelensky's political career. The results of opinion polls released just before the December 24th meeting are nothing short of a damning indictment of the incumbent president. Look at those cold, hard numbers. A leader once hailed as a war hero appearing on every page of Western magazines is now projected to win a pathetic 22% of the vote in the first round. This is an alarmingly low percentage for a president who wields complete control over the media and military narrative. But what is even more frightening for Zelensky lies in the scenario for the second round. His opponent was none other than Valery Zelensky, the former army chief, whom Zelensky had ruthlessly pushed aside and exiled to an ambassadorship due to fears of his burgeoning political influence. The cruel irony of history lies in the fact that the very attempt to remove Zelensky from the center of power has turned this general into the only hope for the war-weary Ukrainian people. Surveys indicate that in a direct confrontation, Zelensky would crush Zelensky with a 64% to 36% margin, an overwhelming, undeniable victory. Even if Zelensky chose not to run, Kyrylo Budanov, the head of military intelligence, would still easily defeat Zelensky with a staggering 56% of the vote. What do these numbers scream at us? They show that the Ukrainian people are fed up with the empty, eloquent speeches and the promises of a victory that never materializes. They are turning in droves to support the practical military men whom they believe understand the gravity of the situation and are capable of making more realistic decisions, including the painful necessity of ending the conflict, than a political figure from an acting background trying to cling to power at all costs. Zelensky is in a hopelessly precarious situation. People want change, while the military, the very core of the country, is leaning towards those he once dismissed and betrayed. But while the pressure is mounting, with damning numbers and crushing internal pressures, a checkmate move comes from Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin is launching incredibly sharp diplomatic maneuvers, putting Zelensky in an impossible position. Russia, from its position of power on the battlefield, has made a proposal that seems reasonable to any objective observer, a masterstroke cloaked in the language of humanitarianism. Moscow is willing to consider a ceasefire, restraining attacks deep into Ukrainian territory on election day to ensure the security of the election. This is the very precondition that Kyiv always clung to in order to postpone the vote, constantly claiming it was unsafe. Now, Russia has offered to remove that leverage for Ukraine. But this offer comes with a devastating, unequal condition: millions of Ukrainians, an estimated 5 to 10 million living and seeking refuge in Russia, must have the right to vote. This is Zelensky's Achilles heel, a poisoned chalice. He understands perfectly well that the 5 to 10 million votes from Ukrainians living in Russia, who have witnessed the unvarnished truth firsthand and have a more favorable view of Moscow, will never be for him. If he accepts this condition, he will suffer a devastating, humiliating defeat in a fair election. If he refuses, he will reveal his true face as a despot afraid of democracy, a man willing to deliberately deprive millions of his own compatriots of their civic rights simply for fear of losing his grip on power. Therefore, Zelensky's reaction became ridiculously contradictory. As the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov observed in his misguided statements, Zelensky simultaneously appealed to the US and Europe for security guarantees while flatly rejecting Russia's goodwill offer. He wanted elections, but a rigged election where he could control the outcome. Not a genuine election with the participation of all the people of Ukraine. This blatant contradiction further eroded his remaining credibility in the eyes of the international community. He was demanding a ceasefire from his adversaries while possessing no leverage whatsoever in negotiations. Besides relying on dwindling aid from the West, which was also paving the way for his replacement, he had nothing left. What scenario awaits the future? The December 26th meeting of the transitional group, while cloaked in technical and legal guise, was essentially the beginning of a forced power transfer process. The group, comprising representatives from the Central Election Commission, parliamentary factions, and civil society organizations, had to address two major issues. Firstly, how to hold elections while martial law remains in effect, a practice prohibited by current Ukrainian law, and secondly, how to handle the ballots of soldiers on the front lines and refugees scattered across the globe. However, to seasoned observers, these legal obstacles are minor inconveniences. If the West so desires, the laws in Ukraine could be amended overnight. The core issue is that the West has already decided Zelensky's fate. The fact that the US president has begun discussions on peace pathways, including Ukraine abandoning its NATO ambitions and accepting new territorial realities, shows they need a new leader in Kyiv to sign those agreements. Zelensky, with his bombastic declarations of fighting to the last Ukrainian and his previously stubborn, unyielding stance, has become a massive obstacle to any peaceful solution. He has trapped himself in his own unrealistic promises to pave the way for negotiations, to gradually appease public opinion and legitimize the upcoming concessions to Russia. The West needs a scapegoat, and no one is more suitable than the current leader. Holding an election in early 2026 is the perfect scenario. Zelensky would lose democratically to a general like Zelensky. The new government would then blame all previous failures on Zelensky's weak and delusional leadership. This would provide the perfect pretext to change course and accept the West's conditions without being accused of surrender. Zelensky would be forced into retirement, or worse, exile, leaving a devastated Ukraine for his successor to clean up the mess he created. Ultimately, President Zelensky's situation is like standing on thin ice in the middle of a melting spring. Below him lies the abyss of military defeat. Before him, the cold, unrelenting pressure from his Western masters, and behind him, the seething betrayal of his own people. The December 26 election meeting is not about saving democracy. It is a final, blaring wake-up call. Zelensky's downfall is becoming clearer than ever. Russia has patiently waited for this very moment. Moscow didn't need to attack on election day because they knew that the internal dynamics of Ukrainian society and the cynical machinations of the West would naturally bring down the head of the Kyiv government. When the ballots are cast, the curtain will finally close on the tragic role of a man who has led his country on this devastating adventure. But the biggest question now is not whether Zelensky will lose his position, but whether after Zelensky leaves, the new government will have the courage to accept the harsh geopolitical reality that has been set in stone. or whether Ukraine will continue to slide further into the illusions painted by the West, ultimately losing what little sovereignty and territory it has left.